Hey everybody, I'm David Nicholson. I'm an engineer at Embedded Intelligence in the DC area. We're a startup. We're developing a product for quality assurance of machine learning models, which, as you can guess, means I have limited spare time. But in that free time, I continue to develop and maintain software I created as a graduate student, including this library I'm going to tell you about today, VOC, which is a neural network framework for researchers studying acoustic behavior. And I want to start out by acknowledging my collaborator, Dr. Yarden Cohen, who is a neuroscientist. He's the head of a lab at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. In his limited spare time, he's out protesting, preventing his country from becoming a fascist dictatorship, and posing for portraits drawn by his daughter, as shown on the right here, with one of their pet canaries that's fluffy, not pooptail. And the reason I continue to develop this software is because I think that the questions that research on animal acoustic communication gets at, those questions are sort of core questions about what makes us human. There's few behaviors that we still think are unique to humans. One of them we're pretty sure about is what I'm doing right now, speaking a language. That said, we know, like I'm showing you in this cladogram here, all groups of animals signal in some way with sounds. And what's more, many of these acoustic behaviors exhibit striking parallels to speech, such as birdsong, bat calls, the signature whistles of dolphins. Many of these behaviors are learned during a critical or sensitive period in development, like speech, and they are refined over thousands of hours of practice. Sort of think of this as like a practice. Yeah, thousands of hours of repeating the behavior. And we also know that the brain areas that produce these behaviors are related across animals, right? So like I'm showing you in this figure from this review on the brain areas that produce learned skills, because of evolution, all vertebrates share the same basic floor plan to their brain. So the bigger point here is that if we study these speech-like behaviors across animals, these acoustic behaviors, and we look at the brain areas that control them, we can get at this, these kinds of core questions like, what is this faculty of language? How did it evolve? And others have argued that just by the very nature of these questions, this field of research is truly interdisciplinary. You need to go from genomics to ecology and everywhere in between. To make progress on these questions, you need big team science, right? These diverse expertises really need to work together. And you need cutting-edge computational methods, which for the purposes of this talk is going to mean deep learning, also known as neural network models. There's reviews on how these models are applied to the study of acoustic communication. We cite them in our proceedings paper. Please check that out if you want to do a deep dive. Why do I keep saying acoustic behavior? Let me explain that first. So in neuroscience, there's been this reckoning, this realization that if we want to understand how the brain produces behavior, we actually have to be able to quantify and model that behavior as it takes place in the real world. Like this example I'm showing you from this, in this figure, it's from this commentary talking about how something like a cat hunting a mouse is more of a natural behavior. And the reason for that is there's this concern that the way we've traditionally studied behavior in the lab in these highly controlled experiments might produce brain activity that's in a totally different regime from what's going on in your and my brain when we're out interacting with this very complex world. And so this means we need to move towards studying behavior as it happens in the real world. And animal vocalizations are an example of this. Animals produce these vocalizations freely. To give you a sense of this, I'm going to play some data that Yarden shared. This is activity of brain cells in a canary as it's singing its song. And what I hope you'll notice is how the firing of these brain cells, these neurons, is coupled to the song. So just before I play this, what you're going to see are some different colored areas lighting up. Those are brain cells. This is calcium signaling. It's been run through an image processing algorithm. And this is the activity in this individual canary's brain as it's freely singing its song. You don't have to dance like I'm. Right. And so as you can imagine, right, if we are going to quantify and model this kind of more complex real-world behavior, and if you're a neuroscientist, get some neural data along with it, you're going to have truly big data, a ton of data, and that means you need to automate the analysis in some way. What is an analysis in terms of acoustic behavior? Many of these model behavior as a sequence of units, and the way that we get these units is usually by segmenting audio, like looking for silent gaps. So to walk you through that, I'm showing you a spectrogram on the top here. That's just how you make a picture of some signal, like sound. You can see that the frequencies are on the y-axis, and then the time is on the x-axis. And the darker areas in that top panel, those are areas of higher power in the spectrum. Right? And I put the black lines around the units that we get out from segmenting the audio so you can see where they are in the spectrogram. The segmenting shown on the bottom, and sort of one bog standard way of doing this is just setting a threshold on the amplitude of the audio and finding the continuous periods above that threshold. And so that's how you would get your sequence of units that you do some analysis on. And we don't actually, we're not sure if this is, or when this is the best way to model acoustic behavior, in part because doing these kind of analyses has been so labor intensive for the reasons I'm going to tell you about. Right? So there's whole reviews, like the one that I'm showing you a figure from here, just talking about the many different ways that you can build models from these sequences of units that you start your analysis with. For one of the things that can make it labor intensive is that you often have an additional step of annotating the units. So that I'm showing you here. This means that some human expert will go in with GUI software and sit there and label each one of the units. And the labels can depend on the analysis, the species that you're looking at, but this takes a lot of time. And one of the reasons that this isn't possible across all animals is that the off-the-shelf signal processing algorithms, just for segmenting the audio, don't work across species. So here's an example, again, from Yarden's model organism, a canary. For this individual, you can set a threshold that segments one of the syllables good, but another syllable in the same song will be over-segmented, and then yet another will be under-segmented. And so this is really a case where legitimately you need a neural network model to solve this problem. I'm going to show you how later. I could talk all day about the different models that we can fit and build using these annotations, but then I wouldn't have time to talk about the library or our results. So here's one very intimidating figure. You don't have to understand it. This is a probabilistic suffix tree model of canary song. And what I want you to notice is that on the right is a model of this syntax model that we fit using more data that we were able to annotate using the neural network algorithm I'm going to tell you about. Right, so this dashed line around the branch on the bottom, that's some detail that we couldn't see until we annotated more data. Right, so sort of the critical gap here is that there's animals that are producing many more sounds than we could ever hope to annotate by hand. I'm going to do something risky during a talk and play a video while I talk. This is a red-eyed vireo. These birds will sing upwards of 20,000 bouts of song per day. And you can hear like a soundscape in the background that's other animals they're interacting with. Right? So if we ever are to have any hope of sort of modeling that and understanding it, we need some way to automate our analysis. And neural networks, as I've hinted at, are one way to do this. There are multiple models proposed for related tasks. Again, there's reviews on this. If you know this literature, many of them will be familiar computer vision models that are just applied to this new domain of acoustic behavior. I'll say more about these models as we go on. A key point here is that the papers sort of proposing these models often have software that accompanies them that's written with different neural network frameworks, Keras, TensorFlow, PyTorch. Let's talk about the tasks that these models set up, tasks in the machine learning sense. So one way you could solve the annotation problem is reducing it to a frame classification task. If you think about the spectrogram I showed you, every time bin in that spectrum, every column, you can just think of that as a frame. It's some way to get features out of a signal. And you can ask some machine learning model to classify each frame. And then in a way I'm going to, again, tell you about later, you can recover your sequence of units that's annotated from those classified frames. See these works from Graves, who sort of set up this task. And multiple models have been proposed to solve this task, including the model that we described, TweetyNet, that I'm going to tell you about, deep audio segmenter, and also an earlier paper from 2016, which used custom Java code, deep audio segmenters written in Keras. We started out in TensorFlow, moved to PyTorch. Maybe you can see a pattern here. There's other models from other literatures that you might want to compare this with, such as this encoder-decoder temporal convolutional network that was applied to frames of video. But you don't have to solve the annotation problem that way. You could solve it as object detection. So these are, again, computer vision models. Their output is a bounding box that is placed around an object in an image. So you can just say that a spectrogram is an image, and the animal vocalizations that are in it are objects, and get bounding boxes around them. Deep Squeak is an example of a model that does that. That's written in MATLAB. And again, as I sort of suggested, you don't always have to think about everything as sequence of annotated units. You could apply some unsupervised models for the same reason we do those in other domains, for dimensionality reduction when you want to cluster or you want to more easily measure similarity. This is a figure from a great paper by Tim Sainberg and collaborators. You can see in the lower right there where they're using UMAP, and they show it does a great job of clustering vocalizations of juvenile bat calls. And the coloring is indicating which call was from which individual, so you see there that UMAP really helps you cluster by individual. There are other methods that do this using neural networks, so Sainberg went on with other authors, including our own Leyland McInnes, to show that you could use a neural network to have a parametric version of UMAP so that you can do this embedding sort of much faster on the fly with this trained neural network model. And there's this auto-encoded vocal analysis that uses VAEs. It's just another flavor neural network. The point here, you don't have to know all these flavors for this talk. It's just that they're, again, implemented in different frameworks. And so if you have questions about how good does my segmentation have to be, if I'm going to embed units that I extract with parametric UMAP, it'd be really nice if they were all built into a single framework that was developed and maintained by research software engineers. I'm not just saying that because I think of myself as a research software engineer now. Hashtag USRICCon 2023. So VOC is our effort to provide that single framework with multiple models and to make it easy for you to experiment with new models that aren't built in, and to do this in a way that requires little or no code, to work with a wide array of data formats, of which there are many because this field is interdisciplinary, and to also understand how much of that expensive human annotated data you're going to need for your task. I'll say more about the models that are built in, but first, how do we achieve this? This is the part where we get to nerd out about code. So VOC asserts that a neural network model can be defined by 4 things. You're going to write that as a class with 4 class variables. There's the network function. There's the loss function you use to update the parameters of that network function. There's the optimizer you use to do that, and then there's some metrics that you use to assess performance. And you're going to apply this model decorator to it, and what that's going to do is give you back a subclass of a model family, which is another class that has all the methods that you would use to train or to evaluate and so on. And then additionally, there is a registry, we call it, that's updated dynamically. So if you apply this decorator to your model that you write in a script instead of something that's built into the library, VOC will know about it. It'll just be there when you call a function. You don't have to worry about entry points or making a pull request to add your model. You can just run it in a script. I'll show you an example of this later. We do have a command line interface. It consists of just a few commands, all of the form of VOC command config file, such as VOC prep config file to prepare a data set, VOC train config file to train a model. Everything else we put in a configuration file that's in the TOML format. The goal there is to avoid having to use a bunch of options on the command line and instead capture all those important sort of metadata about training the model in this configuration file, the hyperparameters, the architecture parameters of the neural network, so that we sort of give you reproducibility by default. We also do work with a wide array of data formats. Like I said, there are many different formats for annotating vocalizations because there's a bunch of different software in different fields. We do this with another package we've developed, Crozetta, that has now been accepted into the PyOpenSci ecosystem, and it's published in the Journal of Open Source Software. I gave a talk at PyCon about Crozetta and PyOpenSci. I hope you'll check that out. Thanks to PySoundFile, awesome library, we're able to work with a wide array of audio formats. We use NumPy for our spectrograms. And then we have this functionality for understanding how much training data you need by running a learning curve. And I'll show you a little bit more about that as we dive into the results. Since we're at SciPy, of course, we totally rely on the scientific Python stack. Nothing would be possible without that. In particular, we use pandas to parse ZSV files we use to represent data sets, and we're able to parallelize everything thanks to Dask. Thank you, Dask. We switched to Lightning as our backend in version 1.0 so that we could better leverage the hardware and focus on the domain that we know about. If you know any of the domain-specific libraries in the Torch ecosystem, the API will be very familiar to you. We have sort of all the same modules that they have. And it's already being used by other groups, VOC, and has been the basis for other papers. We have those in our docs. I hope you'll check those out. Let me sort of really quick sort of explain how we developed VOC. We originally wanted to make our own experiments replicable where we were proposing this neural network model, TweetyNet. And I've talked about this at SciPy before. I hope you'll check these talks out. You could use sort of traditional classical machine learning models to classify features you get out of segments that you extract from audio. But sort of the issue is that the segmenting, like I showed you before, fails for a lot of different species. So you want a method that avoids that. And the way that we achieve that is by using a neural network function that just takes in a spectrogram and gives you back a matrix of probabilities, where classes are on the rows and time bins are on the columns. And then when you take the argmax on that matrix, you get a label for every frame, for every time bin, and then you can recover segmented syllables from that. We sort of walk through the methods in the paper. I'm really going to give you the high gloss so I can get to new results here. We do some post-processing that really helps with that. You'll see that again later. That's important to take away. And again, this is in the paper. I don't want Matt to cut me short on time, so please check that out to walk through the details of the architecture. The way we're going to measure this performance is by looking at how well it classifies every frame, and then we're going to look at syllable error rate, which is an edit distance. That's the sequence of labels we're going to get out of the model, and we're going to ask how many edits do we have to make to get back to the ground truth labels. And sort of the punchline of the paper, again, there's much more nuance in the actual figures. We find that if you just apply a support vector machine to the segments you get from audio, you'd have a really high syllable error rate, right? And this is because a human hasn't gone in and carefully cleaned up the segmentation, this thing that's really labor intensive. In contrast, you can use TweetyNet, just feed in the spectrograms, and you'll have a much lower syllable error rate. And so moving on to what we've got in VOC 1.0, I told you we made it possible to work with a model that's not built in. Here we're using that functionality to do an ablation experiment. We remove this recurrent layer from TweetyNet to show that's important for performance. And we do see that. This is all in the proceedings paper if you want to check that out. Right, so removing the recurrent layer increases the syllable error rate as we would expect. And we are able to show that just writing a script. We also compared to that encoder-decoder temporal convolutional network I mentioned earlier. And this is just to show that we can compare different models in our framework. We can use some of the functionality built into VOC to sort of diagnose, look at the logging we get from training. We don't see any obvious explanation for this difference between the two models. There's plenty of work to be done here, which is sort of the take-home I want you to get. This is like unexplored territory. So I'm not trying to make any broad claims about these models, just showing you, we're able to compare different models in a single framework, which is what we need. Also, some other preliminary results. We've been looking at how VOC performs if we feed in whole spectrograms. We find that improves performance. We have some ideas about that we need to sort of parse out, but just again showing you how we can compare models with our framework. Last but definitely not least, showing that we can have other model families. Here is a parametric UMAP model, like I told you about earlier, where it's parametrized by a neural network. And we're able to train that and embed syllables of Bengalese finch song into this lower dimensional space. So we have a development on GitHub. Please check out what we're doing there. Thank you to all the people that have contributed so far. We also have a forum. I hope if this is interesting to you, you'll star some of those repositories, join the forum. We'd love to have more contributions. And you can find us at all these places. I totally planned for that to be 20 minutes, just like that the whole time.
Yeah, thank you for doing a great job of sticking to time, David. So we have time for questions, and I guess also looking at the agenda, there's a bit more time than I thought there was, because I guess there's 10-minute changeover and not 5-minute changeover. So please ask questions. I'm first going to just go to Slack to see if I have any questions from Zoom. It doesn't seem so. So do we have any questions? So.
I thank you for that talk. I'm going to apologize by throwing you a curveball here, but one of the questions I had is, anyone looked at this for applications outside of bioacoustics? One of the things I've considered this might be useful for is we monitor things like disturbance on ISS, and since you're looking at acceleration spectra with things like shock spectra in there, it might be interesting for the segmentation problem and identification of different kinds of vehicles that are visiting.
Yeah, definitely. People have definitely tried to use these kinds of models for really any kind of time series. And there's a whole literature. So yeah, I'm happy to talk more offline. I can't cite things off the top of my head, but yeah, this is, again, pointing to these are just computer vision models applied to a new domain. And I think it is really interesting to look at other domains, because often sort of all the things that we think we know about these models don't necessarily hold true when you get into if it's a time series, what's the distribution of classes? So yeah. Happy to talk more about that. It's a good question.
The images you put up, it's just amazing to me to see what we can do now. To be able to have the vocal and then to have the neuroimaging that you've done. What's striking to me is those neuroimagings look like clusters. Have you done anything to try to look at correlation of that space to the feature space that you showed embedded at the very last point, to see if there's a correlation or a mechanism that you could use there to pull out additional information that you could use for classification?
Yeah. Right. So can you go to this low dimensional space of the audio and then basically correlate or relate that to neural activity?
That's right.
Yeah, so it's a great question. That's basically where a lot of neuroscience is headed right now. So you can check out Yarden Cohen's paper, where my collaborator, where his papers where he sort of tries to look at this, where there's a history dependence of neural activity that's related to the syntax we see of song and the features. You can also look at, just throwing out examples, the auto-encoded vocal analysis that I mentioned from John Pearson's lab. They are definitely looking at that and trying to ask, how do we relate that to the behavior we see in song? We would love to be able to say oh, there's more variability in both song and neural activity, and we can very easily see this in that low dimensional space. So yes, we are all thinking along those lines. Yeah.
Very cool.
Okay, so it looks like, oh, sorry, we have one more from Matt.
Matt, can you please help Matt ask a question?
Thank you, Matt. I don't have a technical question. I just want to know the story of your very cool logo for back.
Thanks. These are all colors taken from spectrogram. I'm not smart enough to have the opinions that many people at SciPy have about color schemes, but including yourself, I'd love to have feedback. But yeah, just trying to have a consistent ecosystem theme. That's the spectrogram color theme, besides all the other spectrogram color maps.
And how about the fun arrow circle?
Oh, right.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's like a animal call going into a neural network neuron, yes. That is the one most literal. Thank you.
So I have a comment and a question. So the comment is first, congratulations on your Journal of Open Source Software paper. I think that's fantastic. And with my JOS editor hat on, you should all be submitting papers. But I was curious, because I care a lot in the particle physics space about reproducibility of analyses, and you've commented a bit in this talk about how that's something that you also care about and work on. And it seems that this makes it easy to publish, or at least to be able to like define models. But in your community space, is the actual sharing of trained models something that is done, or is that something that's possible? Or?
Yeah, so that's a perfect question. Thank you for asking that. Two things. So yeah, having Crozet out in JOS is great. That's because PyOpenSci has a partnership with JOS, so we basically got reviewed, and then we went immediately to JOS. Hi, Leah, Executive Director of PyOpenSci, who's here, and you should talk with her if that sounds interesting to you. It is awesome. And people are definitely sharing models. You know, we see what people are doing more broadly, and so we try to share trained models as part of the data sets that accompany papers. I do want to, since you brought it up, go back really quick. Because this field is so interdisciplinary, and because there's maybe less infrastructure built up, it can be really hard to read the code, even though we're all doing our best to share. And you know, graduate students are trying to make these full-fledged libraries, but they're also like running experiments, and they're on 5 other projects at the same time, and they're not given training for research software engineering. So we are working on sort of a core library that will make it easier to sort of share your code along with your models and have it be very readable. We have a proceedings paper coming out, Forum Acousticum 2023. So please check that out. Sorry for the shameless plug, but since you brought that up, it's like, yes, we're sharing the models, but then when you look at the code, and I'm talking about like my own code, I'm very guilty of this. It's like, I gave you everything, and then people are like, oh, I didn't read that because you have 500 files in your, your project repositories. So yeah, also a good question.
All right, let's thank David again, and
thank you.